The year was 1897, the place Chicago, and L. Frank Baum, at the age of 41, was starting over, embarking on yet another new venture. He had tried it all: businessman, actor, playwright, newspaper publisher. He had even tried to raise an exotic breed of chickens. His latest effort was to write a children's book. As always, his family remained steadfastly behind him, but privately they could not help but wonder whether he would ever find his place in the world, for Baum was a dreamer, a hopeless romantic who had let his vivid imagination lead him through life, and up till now it had led him only to failure.
The thing that's fascinating to me about L. Frank Baum is that he was so much more than just a writer. His childhood was very special. His parents had money from the oil industry, and they were able to educate him in a very personal way.
I think it's why his imagination was limitless, and he never learned what too many kids learn today. Got to be in a hard world. Leave your imagination until later. You can always do that later. No, it doesn't work that way.
When not engaged in homeschooling, Baum loved to disappear into a book or to wander over the expansive grounds of the family estate, where he played on the yellow plank road and found a deep fascination with a scarecrow that guarded over the family's crops. By the time he was a teenager, Baum was already a hopeless dreamer. His parents, fearing he lacked any direction in his life, decided to send him away to military school.
Frank went to Peekskill Military Academy, detested the highly structured life, became ill. It seems like every time he got stressed, he became ill, and left.
At the age of 14, Baum had his first encounter with publishing after seeing the wonders of a printing press at work. As usual, his doting parents indulged his new passion by buying him a small press, and within a few weeks, he and his younger brother were already turning out their first newspaper.
It was called the Roselawn Home Journal, and it was published whenever they could publish it, and would hand it out mostly to family members and so forth. And I think actually he started thinking about the world of printing.
But for someone with as fertile and active an imagination as Frank's, sticking to one thing proved a great challenge, and he found himself drawn into a kaleidoscope of other interests that ranged from stamp collecting to raising a select breed of chickens known as Hamburgs.
Then he got into acting. His family wasn't so excited about him getting into acting, but supported him, ended up buying a theater so that he could write plays, perform plays, produce plays, be very involved in that, and eventually travel with them, which he did successfully until the theater burned down.
Baum's most successful play was The Maid of Iran, a sentimental melodrama he wrote, directed, and in which he starred, traveling with the production on tour as far west as Chicago and into Canada.
I think he was really beginning on what he would consider to be his foremost career, and one which probably interested him the most.
While between acting engagements, Baum met the woman who was to change his life and destiny forever.
If the old adage, opposites attract, is true, there's probably been no better exemplification of that than Frank Baum and his wife Maud, because where she was forthright and business-oriented and common-sensible, he had the great flights of fantasy that made him, at heart and mind, an 8-year-old for his entire adult life in some ways. Not that he couldn't buckle down as well, but Maud more or less ruled the family roost.
Maud was the daughter of the great 19th century feminist Matilda Jocelyn Gage, an ardent advocate of women's rights and one of the driving forces behind the women's suffrage movement. Their first encounter came at a festive holiday party in December of 1881.
There was a reception at Baum's sister-in-law's home, and Jossie's mother, Josephine Baum, said, Frank, this is Maud Gage.
Well, immediately he's thinking, Maud Gage. That's Matilda Jocelyn Gage's daughter. She hates men. What are you doing? But being the dapper gentleman that he was, took one look at her and was speechless, something actors are not supposed to be. And he looked at her and he kind of mumbled, and remembering the words that Harriet had said, I know you're going to love her, He looked straight at her face. Miss Gage, consider yourself loved. Well, Mr. Baum, I take that as a promise. See to it that you live up to it.
And it was evidently love at first sight. They were married within a year.
I think that was really a turning point in his life because she allowed the childhood imagination to bloom, didn't squelch it, and I think actually encouraged it.
There's an interesting piece about him that he had this very creative, sort of adventurous spirit, but also had a real deep sense of responsibility and taking care of his family.
Frank tried his best to settle down to the responsibilities of a wife and family, taking a job as a head salesman for one of the family businesses, Baum's Castorine Company. For several years, everything ran smoothly, but once again, fate intervened.
About that time, the family businesses went into terrible reversals, and so you have somebody who grew up in considerable comfort, now struggling to make a living, at which point Baum decided to take his wife and move to Aberdeen in Dakota Territory, where she had I think a brother and a sister.
It was the new hub, the new jumping off place, the opening of the West, the place where it was all happening. He went there with these great ideas of opening up this great Baum's Bazaar.
Baum never thought second rate. It always had to be the best. If he was going to open a store in South Dakota, it would have to be a luxury store, and it would have everything from bamboo scratchers to a fancy marble soda fountain.
But Baum's timing was off. Just as he arrived in South Dakota, the area fell under a prolonged and devastating drought that parched the land and withered the hopes and dreams of its inhabitants. For a time, Frank struggled along bravely, even publishing a local newspaper, the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer. But his optimism was no match for the harsh realities imposed by the unforgiving environment.
After the failure of all of his enterprises in Aberdeen, South Dakota, he realized this was not the town to stay in, nor could he keep his now 4 boys and Maud there. So he looked around and he decided that Chicago was probably the best bet.
Frank set out for Chicago full of optimism for what opportunities lay ahead in America's second largest city. But he soon found the going no easier than it had been in South Dakota. After some time, he finally managed to secure a job as a traveling salesman for Pitkin & Brooks, which sold fine china and glassware throughout the Midwest.
Travel in those days had to be very tough. Train, buggy, whatever it was. And of course you had to carry all of your stuff with you. But I think it also gave him time when he wasn't selling or sitting in that hotel room to think about his stories and to write things down and explore his own imagination.
Alfred Baum spent a lot of his time on the road when his children were growing up. And whenever he came home, he would spend his evenings with them. And he loved telling them stories.
The local children would find out, and the next thing you know, he'd be on the steps on that nice evening in Chicago, a little breeze off the lake or something, telling all these wonderful stories to the children, and obviously watching their response, until the local constable would have to come by and say, "Susie, your parents are looking for you," because they always knew where the local kids would be.
Frank Baum was essentially an entertainer. And in those days, that was a great, great gift. It always is, but in those days, there was no radio, there were no phonographs, there were no movies. A lot of people couldn't afford stage shows, and people made their own entertainment.
At the time, his children were learning their Mother Goose rhymes, so he told some stories based upon the rhymes.
He took the Mother Goose tales and basically just told them as you would tell them the bedtime story, or you would talk to a child and tell them the story instead of reading it to them in either rhyme or imagery that they were not used to, especially since most of them came from Europe. They were not necessarily recognizable, or all of the places were recognizable to the children. So he was trying to explain them and basically kind of Americanize it.
I don't think he fully understood how powerful his ability to write for children was. He always attributed his decision to try that in his 40s to his mother-in-law.
Matilda is the one who would come to visit the Baums as the marriage obviously succeeded. And she would listen to Frank tell the stories to the children And it was she, although she died, God bless her, 2 years before The Wizard of Oz was published, it was she who, again, is part of family legend, is saying in so many words, Frank Baum, you're a damn fool if you don't write those stories down. And of course he did, and we have Maud and her family to thank for that.
Encouraged by his family, Baum did write his stories down, and the resulting book, Mother Goose in Prose, was published in 1897. The book created quite a stir within literary circles. Unlike the typical children's books of the time, Mother Goose in Prose was sumptuously illustrated with drawings by the talented Maxfield Parrish.
Mother Goose in Prose, being his first book, was quite a success and gave him the confidence to do another book called Father Goose, his book. And this was a series of rhymes which he did, and these were his own. And he was lucky to find W.W. Denslow, who illustrated the book.
It was absolutely ideal for both of them because Baum had the pictures in his head and put them down with words. Denslow could translate exactly what Baum put on paper.
You had the very first Baum and Denslow collaboration, and to everyone's amazement in the United States, it became the best-selling children's book of 1899.
Father Goose went into 6 printings. By today's standard, they wouldn't have been long, but in those days, 50,000 was a big press run. And that really set him as a children's author.
As the accolades for Father Goose came rolling in, all of the hardship and struggle began to come into perspective for L. Frank Baum, and at last he could see that his years of fruitless wanderings had a purpose. Frank now let his fertile imagination run free, and one day, while entertaining a group of children, he began to tell the tale of a little girl named Dorothy and her adventures in a magical and mysterious faraway land.
And according to the family legend, one little girl in the crowd piped up and said, Mr. Baum, where did this happen? Where did they live? And Baum was nonplussed, but he glanced around the room and built anticipation by repeating the question, where did they live? Where did they live? As his, killing time trying to come up with something. And his eye caught his filing cabinet, which had 2 drawers. The first drawer was labeled letter A-letter N. The second one was lettered O-Z. And they all lived in the land of Oz.
People ask, well, who does the Cowardly Lion really mean? Is the Scarecrow a real person? All of these things. And I really don't believe they were. I think these were just characters that were streaming through his head, and he just had to have an outlet. And on many of those long trips, when he had time in that hotel room, he supposedly wrote down bits and pieces of the story on anything at hand. And I know Maud used to get angry with him because he would get up in the middle of the night and write on the wallpaper in the room. But he didn't want to lose it.
So he started writing about Oz and got the story written down, and then realized that in order for this story to come alive for the children, it needed to have good illustrations. And he and W.W. Denslow got together and created these color plates that the publisher didn't want to publish because it would be so expensive.
Baum and Denslow had this ambitious scheme. They wanted the book in color, which was almost unheard of. There were 24 color plates. There were over 100 two-color illustrations that changed as Dorothy went from one place to another.
He and Denslow were determined that these books would come out with the color plates because he wanted the story to come alive for the children. And that's what was most important for him. So they put the money up to publish these books with the color plates, and of course they sold immediately and had to go into a second printing before Christmas, and they had just been out for a few months.
To have a book like that in 1900 for children was enormously innovative. 24 full-color plates and 100 line drawings in 2 colors throughout the book, and designed specifically by Denslow, so sometimes the drawings were underneath the actual type. It was amazing for a children's book to be that elaborate and that welcoming. And this was before there were publicity machines and media hoopla. This book was succeeding on the basis of its strong, strong appeal to children and how it captured their imagination and their dreams.
I think the success of The Wizard speaks for itself. The company couldn't keep up with it, and it is one of the most popular books of all time. As far as writing another Oz book, the success, that's great, wonderful. I'm glad people enjoy it. Now I'm going to move on to something else, or so he thought. With the success of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and his other early books, he now had the money and the confidence to do what he really wanted to do, and that was to do a play.
But Frank's ideas about gearing the play to children were overruled by the show's director, Julian Mitchell, who surprised Frank by turning his fairy tale into an adult musical extravaganza featuring a bevy of young beauties and advertising the show with the provocative come-on of pretty girls and more pretty girls. Although he had mixed emotions about what had become of his beloved story, Frank was nonetheless delighted by the huge hit the play became.
This was the most successful musical play of its day. It was sort of like the Cats of 1902, 1903, 1904, 1905. It ran on for years, and there were at least two companies. And that's really where Baum made his fortune. He was very successful as a children's book writer, but the musical comedy made a lot more money.
With the financial security that success brought, Frank was able to indulge his love of travel, and he and Maud went on several excursions, including trips to Europe and Egypt. Their favorite stopping place became Southern California and the elegant Hotel del Coronado, where the Baums wintered between 1904 and 1910.
The Dell and L. Frank Baum were a perfect combination. And I think when you look at the hotel's architecture and you see the whimsy of it and the Oz-like aspects of it, you understand why Baum felt at home here. Baum actually did a lot of his writing while he was here. He's quite disciplined about his writing. He claimed that he started after breakfast and wrote through early afternoon every day. And there are actually 3 in the Oz book series that he wrote during his stays here. And one was The Emerald City of Oz, Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz was another, and then The Road to Oz was the 3rd book that he actually wrote here in Coronado.
When Frank Baum published The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in 1900, it was a done deal. It was a single volume, a complete fairy tale beginning, and no thought of a continuation. But because the stage play was such a hit 2 years later, and then for a half a dozen years after that on Broadway and on tour, more and more and more children were exposed to the joy of the Scarecrow and Tin Woodman and the concept of the Land of Oz, and the book just kept selling, so that after 4 years, he wrote, by public demand, a sequel.
So The Marvelous Land of Oz and a number of other books began to follow, Dot and Tot in Maryland and so forth, always looking for a new venue other than Oz, but always coming back to Oz because it was being requested the most.
Although he was thrilled by the tremendous following his books had generated, Baum was anxious to explore other ideas beyond the land of Oz. So Baum began leading a secret life, writing dozens of other stories, both for children and adults, under various assumed names, some of which were quite surprising.
Beginning in, about 1904 or 5, he started a series of books called Aunt Jane's Nieces for his publishers Riley and Britton under the name of Edith Van Dyne. And nobody's sure where the name came from. They wanted some other fancy name, and he said, no, it's going to be Edith Van Dyne. And until the day he died, virtually no one except his closest associates and wife knew that Edith Van Dyne was, in fact, L. Frank Baum. They were probably one of his biggest moneymakers.
I think Baum was constantly looking for new ways to express himself.
In 1908, he embarked upon an ambitious and innovative showcase for the Oz stories, which he called the radio plays, or the fairy logs. To ensure the radio plays were created exactly as he envisioned them, Baum was forced to dip deeply into his considerable fortune, much deeper than he had hoped.
When we go back and take a look at Maud and L. Frank when they first met, I doubt she realized, but maybe he did, that she was the financial pillar of the family. And she allowed Frank to do a lot of his things and unfortunately explore his imagination and I think lose a lot of the money in the various adventures.
In 1911, Baum went bankrupt, and he had to rethink his finances. He may not have. He may probably returned to the Land of Oz because he needed financial aid. So he wrote his 7th Oz book, Patrick Earl of Oz, in 1913, and it was as successful as the earlier books.
In 1910, After a number of extended holidays on the West Coast, Baum and his wife decided to settle permanently in Southern California. The place they chose was a sleepy little hamlet just outside of Los Angeles called Hollywood. There they built a fine home that Baum whimsically named Oscott.
At Oscott, he had a big backyard, started his own garden, became very good at growing chrysanthemums and dahlias.
As he had done wherever his travels had taken him, Baum threw himself into local society, joining clubs and making friends throughout the community.
Baum never really abandoned the theater, and indeed, his best theater writing, and I think the most fun he ever had in the theater, were toward the end of his life when he started writing musicals for himself and his friends for a society called the Uplifters. It was probably one of the happiest times in Baum's life when he was acting and writing and playing around. I think it brought the joy back to it because he wasn't trying to get rich off of it.
In choosing Hollywood for a home, Baum was a pioneer. Not more than 6 months after his arrival, the very first movie studio was established there, and within a few years, Hollywood would become the center of the motion picture industry. Even before coming to Hollywood, Baum had recognized the power of motion pictures to tell a story, and in 1914, with a group of prominent friends from the Los Angeles Athletic Club, he formed the Oz Film Manufacturing Company. Baum immediately threw himself into producing a series of Oz stories, but once again, he was ahead of his time.
Kids were not being brought to the theaters by their parents. The parents wanted to get away from the children or didn't think this was an appropriate medium for the children. Just a whole bunch of things which basically spelled disaster.
And the company failed within a year of its opening. But still, L. Frank Baum had the vision that would eventually become the 1939 Wizard of Oz. He knew the Wizard of Oz would become a successful motion picture.
So here's a case where it didn't really fail. He was just so far ahead of his time, it just couldn't work. L. Frank's health towards the last couple of years, probably beginning about 1915, 1916, began to go downhill. I believe by the time he was about 60, 59, 60, I think he realized that something was going on. None of us want to face it, but I think he realized that that time would come. As he aged, and I guess the cigars and so forth caught up with him, it was harder for him to write, but he still kept up as hectic a pace as he possibly could. And there was one particular period of time, Nawad noticed he wasn't typing much in the morning, if anything. And he'd go down and he'd sit and he'd move around and he'd work in the garden and he'd sit down. Then he'd come in for lunch and, well, Frank, how's the writing going? It's not working. It's just this story, I just can't get it to work out. And this went on for 2 or 3 weeks. And finally, one day for lunch, he came in and sat down, and she noticed that he had a lot of writing on his pad. Well, Frank, did you work out all the difficulties? I said, well, Maud, no. I just let the characters do what they wanted to. And I think that is probably a window into his mind. I think the ideas and the characters are there, and when they're ready, they will say, okay, Frank, grab your pencil and write this down, because here it goes.
Because his health was somewhat frail, he actually worked ahead and completed a couple of extra Oz books that would carry the series on if he should die.
By the spring of 1919, Baum knew he was dying. His already weakened heart was giving out on him, and there were times when he was barely able to lift his head from his pillow. Yet even as his body failed, Baum's vivid imagination remained as fertile as ever. Early on the morning of May 6, 1919, L. Frank Baum awakened for the last time. Turning to his wife, he uttered the words, "Now we can cross the shifting sands," and within a moment, he was gone.
When he died, I remember the New York Times a few days later reported it on their editorial page and just said, in effect, L. Frank Baum is dead, and the children, if they knew it, would mourn.
But no one felt the loss as much as his beloved and devoted Maud.
When you read the letter that Maud wrote the day after his death, I don't think she ever let people know how really hard it was on her, because basically they were each other's life. He devoted his entire life to her. If she needed something, he didn't do something else. He was there.
He told her on his deathbed that she was the first and the only person he ever loved, and she told him the same thing.
I think it's a great testament to him in his feelings and the things that he's said and done, that Maud stood by him, thick and thin, no matter what it was. A terrific love story that would make Hollywood proud, I think.
L. Frank Baum allowed children to dream. It's something that you did not find much in 19th century American children's literature. You don't find that much in contemporary American children's literature either.
He always had children around him. He loved to spend time with children. He said to please a child is a sweet and lovely thing. And I think that really comes through in his writing, that he had a sense of the child's world.
This man had a tremendous zest for life, I think, and very creative and very, really into his imagination, but able in a unique kind of way to materialize and bring it back into a concrete form, which is an art. It's just a gift that he had.
L. Frank Baum is the man who gave us The Land of Oz. L. Frank Baum gave us Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, the Cowardly Lion, Glinda, the Wicked Witch of the West, Toto, the Munchkins. He gave us The Yellow Brick Road, The Emerald City, The Poppy Field. Could there possibly be a more indelible series of characters or images than these? That all came out of the imagination of one mind.
And if you had to pull one real thing out of all of it, and I think he realized it at the end, when all things are difficult and it seems the darkest, look within, because that's where the answer to your question has always been.